Well, the scene has changed again. Not quite so obvious where she is now. Um, Chapter one, she was in Cambridge. Chapter two, she was at the British Museum in the library. Chapter three, I think she's gone home. She's in her own study in her house in London. And this is a portrait of her, I think, by her sister, who was a painter. Um, can't remember. I can't remember her sister's name right now. Quite a famous painter. And she's at home, and the books that she's looking at are from her own library, her own personal library. So the scene has changed, and she's not out in the world being buffeted about by officials at Cambridge or taking disappointing books out at uh, the British Library. She's at home and she's thinking. Chapter three, quite a remarkable chapter, and I think you can boil down her question here to what she says at the beginning. She says here, "For it is a perennial puzzle why no woman wrote a word of that extraordinary literature when every other man, it seemed, was capable of song or sonnet." And that period that she's talking about is the Elizabethan period in England, and it's the time of Shakespeare. Why is it that there are no writers? Why there were no women writers during Shakespeare's time? What is it? What accounts for the fact that we have at a time when poetry and drama in England was flowering, so that everybody wrote, and there are talented writers everywhere. None of them were women. It's the question that she's focusing on here in chapter three, and she has kind of an answer which she develops, which is not a simple answer. Um, and I think that there are two parts of it. A lot of what she discusses is Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, I think, for her, as we'll see, is the example of the great poet. That is, if we look back in English literature and we think about the greatest poet, the greatest writer in the English language, is probably general agreement that it's Shakespeare. And her question is, could Shakespeare have been a woman? That is, could a woman in the 16th century, the 1500s, basically. I think Shakespeare died around 1610, so mostly in the 1500s and into the 1600s. Could a woman have done what Shakespeare did? And she kind of answers that with a fictional story. She imagines Shakespeare had a sister. She calls her Judith. It's completely made up. And he says, well, what would have happened to Judith? What if Shakespeare had a sister who was born just as talented as he was? Well, first of all, she would have most likely gotten almost no education. Maybe she would have learned to read, but she would have not had much formal education. Secondly, she would have been discouraged from wasting her time with books and writing. And thirdly, at a very young age, her parents would have pressured her to marry her off to some man, and say that she rebelled. This is all what she writes. It's amazing. Say that Judith rebelled and ran away to London like her brother William did. And what if she had been attracted to the theater like William Shakespeare was? Shakespeare starts out as somebody who holds the horses at the door and then becomes an actor and then becomes a playwright. She would have been denied all that. They would have laughed at her. Women were not allowed to act. My understanding is at that time it was still the practice for men to take the women's roles. She would have never been taken seriously, and he imagines that she would have gotten pregnant and committed suicide. I mean, which is pretty dramatic, but not um, not incredible. Right? I mean, it's believable. So one of the things she's saying is that, well, one of the reasons there's no women writers at that time is because women were denied the opportunities. I mean, there are very rare instances where we do have writing from women from the 16th century, but very little. And what can account for that is women, like the lower classes, right? Like the peasantry, like the poor people of England, were denied the kind of opportunities that would have been necessary in order to develop themselves as writers. But there's more. She goes on uh, to say that even in the 19th century, when there were great women writers, and that's really where women in English literature begin to really flower. There are women authors in the 18th century and the 1700s, slowly. And then there's Jane Austen at the beginning of the 19th century in the 1800s, who is this miracle who she will come back to. But then there are more. There's the Bronte sisters, there's George Eliot. But generally speaking, in the 19th century, things were still discouraging for a woman to be a writer, but not just the material conditions, the economic conditions, the educational opportunities were denied them. It's something else. And I think that this is important if you're going to read this book seriously to think about her thesis, which is essentially that the kind of discouragement and prejudice, misogyny really, that women were subject to pretty much ruined them as writers. And this is a kind of a complicated thesis, but her thesis is basically if you are mistreated, if you are victimized by injustice, then this serves as a real obstacle to your development as an artist. Because the goal was to be like Shakespeare, who wasn't bothered by anything, who just, his talent was allowed to flow so that nothing blocked it. The kind of resentments that grow up from being victimized within us. And this goes whether we're women, whether we're minorities, ethnic or racial minorities, whether we are poor, that her theory really is an enormously interesting theory, which will develop in the course of the rest of the chapters. But the real obstacle for women, and by extension, other uh, marginalized people, are prevented from becoming great writers because they have the distractions of their own injustices. Shakespeare didn't have that. She sees the resentments that grow up, the fighting that you have to do as a person who has been discriminated against, as being antithetical to the kind of work that needs to be done to produce really great work, whether that's writing or composing or painting or any other of the fine arts. It's quite an amazing thesis.